Tom, we're back. We're doing this one last time, I hope for a long time, virtually.
Yep.
And you're in some new digs there. You've got this little light shining down on you like a halo, coming across as the angel of the Vino Veritas Society today.
That is something I've never been accused of, Dave. I've been called many things. I don't know that I've ever been called an angel. This is a new thing. All my teachers from back when I was young would be chuckling if they heard this.
Well, I said you look like one.
Yeah, that's
it's
right.
just the light. I didn't say you were.
I'm in Houston, Texas right now at the home of my sister-in-law, and that great looking American flag back there. That's my brother-in-law made that from a solid chunk of wood. It's really cool.
That's really cool. I will say that's one of the cooler. The whole background, the whole thing looks just
Yeah.
absolutely awesome. It's too bad it's in Houston.
Well, I was going to say, when we want to put on a quality podcast, maybe I have to start traveling to Houston more often.
We need to get back in the studio together. It's always more fun when
It's
I can
true.
sit across the table from you.
It's true. It's true.
I think there's a lot for us to talk about today on this week's podcast. There's
Yeah.
so many different things happening in the news. There's so many different conversations. You know, we've complained almost for the last few months that the media has protected Joe Biden so much,
Right.
and has protected this administration so much that there hasn't been a whole lot of news to really talk about. And so we've gotten into some of the more philosophic and some of the more interesting things. You did miss the biggest news story we've probably had in the last couple of months, which was the Kyle Rittenhouse story.
Right.
But all of a sudden in the last week or so, it seems to me at least that there has been a huge uptick in the number of stories going on. And at the end of the day, for me, I think we can pin them all around the proper purpose of government. We can talk about every single one of them. Is the government in certain circumstances, both, well, all three, legislative, judicial, and executive,
Yeah.
are they fulfilling the obligation of safety? I'd bring two major news topics from that sense. One, we've seen this huge rash of smash and go robberies in San Francisco and some other cities across the country. And
Right.
they're arresting these guys and then just letting them out with no bail and just saying, go ahead. So talk about no respect for private property.
It's worth pointing out with it's really a new kind of crime. I mean, crime is no new thing in the United States. It's no new thing in human history. There have always been people stealing, right, and vandalizing and damaging other people's property. But the new character of crime in the modern progressive world is the brazenness. These guys are just walking in. They don't care if they're on camera. They know they're on camera, and they honestly don't care. And they're in no hurry. They take their time. They pick the stuff that it's like they're shopping, right, and walk out because they know that it's very unlikely that they're actually going to be held accountable or punished. And all this goes back to one of the core pieces of progressive political philosophy is this notion that the individual at the end of the day really is not responsible for himself, that everything is a product of systemic causes. And so if someone is turning to crime, right, the progressive view as well, it must be, the system has created these problems that are leading these people to these kinds of actions. It's not actually their responsibility. And a lot of criminals love that view. They think this is great because it's cover. It's a way to get off the hook and evade responsibility for criminal behavior.
I've made the argument in the past on podcasts, and I think you actually have too, that the progressive government is really organized crime, right? It's a mob, it's mafia. We've talked about the idea of business. They charge you to have the right to go into business, and then once you're in business, they charge you to claim to protect you. They don't always do it. They just protect you from everybody but themselves. And what's really interesting about this is these smash and grab robberies you could really compare to organized crime, right? These are highly organized, highly planned robberies. And at the top of the hierarchy is the DA, who works for the government,
Right.
but is
Right.
letting these guys off and saying, I'm here to protect you.
That's right.
It's really this odd circumstance.
Yeah, it is. And and I hadn't really thought about going into this, but it's worth mentioning for our listeners the contrast between violent, well, I was going to say violent uh, property crimes, theft, vandalism, destruction of physical property. And then I was reminded last summer during the, those waves of riots
Yeah.
in 2020. Nicole Hannah Jones, she's the main editor and author behind the New York Times's 1619 Project. She came out with a statement last year saying that property crimes are not violence. They can't be violence because property can just be replaced. That's just a matter of taking other people's money and rebuilding things. So she doesn't consider that to be violent. I do. I think if someone comes in and uses physical force and damages someone else's property or steals someone else's property, that's a violent crime. And we're letting those kinds of crimes go. These DAs, as we're talking about, these prosecutors. Meanwhile, we're arresting more people than ever on things like drug charges, right? The war on
Yeah.
drugs is still very much
Mhm.
ramped up. And I mean, there's an entire industry of both privately owned and government run prisons and guards and prosecutors and lawyers. And I mean, there's a whole industry
Sure.
that really revolves around the war on drugs, which, arguably, I would say someone who, I don't know, buys a bag of dope and sits at home and does it. To me, that guy is a far lower concern than the person walking into a store and taking someone else's property or destroying it.
Sure. You and I actually didn't get to talk about this because we had Cody filling in for
Hmm.
you on the Rittenhouse trial stuff. What you said about Nicole Hannah Jones
Yeah.
was a major part of the conversation. Should you have a right to defend your property or property in general with lethal force?
Right.
And if they're defining it as not as property damage and property theft is an important part of the conversation. The other thing that was in the news in terms of government not fulfilling its proper
Yeah.
purpose of government, I don't want to go too deep into this one because I do want to get into all the ways they're overstepping their proper purpose of government. But the other thing that caught me this week, I want to make sure our audience is aware of because I did not see it in the news almost at
Right.
all. China is in conversations with Equatorial Guinea about building a deep seaport on the western coast of Africa that would be a military base, a place to resupply and
Okay.
refuel different ships, to have port to take off planes and things like that. It really becomes a threat
Yeah.
to us, and we China's made no they haven't hidden at all the fact that they want the Chinese Communist Party to dominate the world. They want it to run the world.
I'm going to pull a lesson from it's kind of a famous professor of international relations out at the Claremont colleges. He's no longer with us. His name was Harold Rood, Rood. And within the realm of political science, that subdiscipline of international relations is particularly infested with nihilists and multiculturalists, not judging other kinds of regimes and ways of life. And so Harold Rood was this wonderful bright spot of sober strategic thinking. And he was often fond of doing things like he would just hold up a map and he would ask questions like, why are nations interested in going to certain places where they're going? So if you imagine in your mind a map of the
Mm-hmm.
world, and you see the United States right in the center of it. To the west of the United States is a great big ocean, right? The Pacific Ocean. And then at the far western end of the Pacific Ocean is China. They lie to the west of the United States. Now, if you go east of the United States, right, there's the Atlantic Ocean. You bump into Europe.
Right.
And if you go straight south from there, why, there's Africa. And isn't it curious that China wants to be on the west coast of Africa, which means they literally would surround the United States. They would be to the west of us, they would be to the east of us. Why might China be interested in going to the western coast of Africa? Could it have anything to do with being in the strategically superior position of being able to launch offensive attacks from both sides?
And it's interesting to discuss that this week of all weeks, because this week is the 80th anniversary of Pearl Harbor, which brought the United
Yeah,
States obviously into World War II, and
yeah,
it was the second front, right? China's essentially creating two fronts that we would have to defend the United States against would they ever decide to
exactly.
attack. And it was a two front assault on Germany, the expanded German occupation that led to their
Yeah.
demise.
This is a lost kind of political science. The political science of thinking in terms of grand strategy, big nation states building armies and navies and deploying them in certain ways, and observing these things and asking these basic questions. Why are they doing this? What is their interest? What might their interest be? We can't get inside their minds. What we can do is watch. We can watch and see where do they allocate their own resources. What is their, China's a place with millions of starving, desperately poor people, and yet they want to go building seaports, naval ports on
Yeah.
around the world. And we, of course, should think about that in a strategic way in terms of actual war. What would that look like? Should something, I mean, that would be a terrible, horrific, global, world historic event if we were to go to war with China. But even if we didn't actually go to war, even if there were mere threats of war, does that put China in a position of strategic superiority to be able to threaten us in ways if they're literally surrounding the United States, and can aim threats from both directions? Probably. It's probably not in the interest of the United States to have China doing that sort of thing.
Right. And I just bring this up because it's for all of the time and effort that this administration in the executive branch and the Oval Office, as well as Congress, is putting into all of these completely unconstitutional things that don't fit the proper purpose of government, that they shouldn't be
Yeah.
concerned about. This is one thing in particular that I think we'd be crazy to think is not a concern. And at the same
Hmm.
time, we're getting no information and no assurances that we're safe from a Chinese attack or a Chinese threat.
Dave, I'm going to put a constitutional point on what you're talking about, and that is if you look in the Constitution, most of the powers there are powers related to war, military, national security, national defense. In Article 1, that's the article of the Constitution that creates Congress. And in Section 8 of Article 1, there's a list of the few powers that we, the people, have delegated to members of Congress. And if you read through that list, I mean, it's striking. The majority of them are national defense, national security related. The power to declare war, for example, that is a power that belongs to Congress, according to the Constitution. The power to raise an army, to provide for a navy, all these kinds of things are
Mm-hmm.
related to national central mission or job of the federal government, figuring out how to keep the United States, how to keep the American people safe, how to protect their rights in a dangerous world where hostile regimes might want to come hurt Americans, hurt the United States. And this is one of the great challenges of having a big sprawling unconstitutional administrative welfare state. Our federal government now is so busy doing unconstitutional things, illegitimate things, things it's not supposed to do. It's a real question whether those
Right.
people in the federal government are actually focusing on their number one mission, which is making sure the United States is safe in a dangerous world.
And think about how that expands out into our individual lives, right? We've talked about this since day one of the Vino Veritas Society. It's one of our precepts. The idea of private property, right? This idea that you have a right to your property. The reason we have government, the primary purpose of government is so that we can do things with our property to advance
Yeah.
our quality of life, to make our own lives better. If we are instead, and I think I can speak for a lot of our members, I think I can speak for myself, I can speak for a lot of the other people who are not yet members of the Vino Veritas Society, we are spending a lot more time today than we have in 30 of our own private property.
Mhm.
We are spending time, a lot more time learning how to be trained in self-defense, learning how to be trained with weapons. We've seen this enormous spike over the last couple of years in gun purchases by people who in the past we never would have expected to actually go out and shoot a gun, let
Right.
alone purchase one and learn how to
Right.
use it.
I want to add that there's whole everything you say is correct, and there's this entire additional layer of trying to protect property in the form of, think of how many business owners hire teams of bureaucrats and lawyers and accountants and experts to help them navigate the mountains of regulations, which is all a form of trying to protect their property. They don't want some
Right.
regulatory agency coming in and shutting down their business, right? Taking away their
Yes.
property. So even that whole realm of compliance is a form of people trying to protect their property.
I didn't even think about that, but you're 100% right. And so you take these two ideas, right? And you take this whole thing of all of these ways we're now investing our time and resources and energy and brain power and everything else into just the ability to protect our own property,
Yeah.
that we don't even have this ability to put in the time to actually go build a business, or several people don't. They lose resources financially, they
Mhm.
lose resources in terms of ideas and time and opportunity costs and everything else are all lost because we can't rely on our government to actually do the one thing that it exists for the primary purpose of, and that's the protection and security of our private property as individuals,
Yeah.
both from domestic uh, organized crime and foreign
That's
governments.
right. That you're absolutely right. That this is the challenge. That I'm going to keep repeating this till I either have no breath left in me or until I don't need to say it anymore. The problem with a progressive administrative state is that government does many things it's not supposed to do, and then the things it is supposed to do, it doesn't do it all, or it does it very poorly. You mentioned earlier the upcoming anniversary of Pearl Harbor, and I mean, we think, and we were just talking about, China expanding its military reach and scope around the world, this whole realm of national security. You would think that we have learned some lessons. You would hope in an age of progressivism that we've made some progress since World War II, right? Pearl Harbor was the real catalyst that kind of launched the United States into World War II in a very active way, and yet it's almost like we're taking steps backward. Right now in Europe, there's a conversation going on. There's a code of medical ethics that came out of World War II, and it really springs from the savage, barbaric practices of the German Nazis. When people talk about the concentration camps, they think of slave labor and then the mass executions, the death camps, and they were all of that. They were also engaged in these perverse, nefarious they called them medical experiments. I mean, in some ways they were mere torture. In other ways they were a kind of research, but it was being done on subjects against their will, and the results in many cases were horrific. They were experimenting with ways to sterilize people and all kinds of terrible things. And so the Nuremberg Code comes out of that experience. And if you look up the Nuremberg Code, it's really interesting. The very first precept, I think there are 10 if I recall, but the very first one says you can't do medical research on someone against their will. And yet, what is really going on, not just in the United States, but really on a global basis with these vaccines? This is an ongoing experiment. There's a lot about the vaccines that we don't know. There's a lot about the vaccines that scientists cannot know simply because there hasn't been
Right.
enough time. There hasn't been enough time to collect data. Here's an example. No one knows what the results are of these vaccines over a 10 or 20 or 30-year time period. They can't know because 10 or 20 or 30 years hasn't actually gone by. And so this is an ongoing experiment. And yet these mandates, these governments are both here in the United States at some local levels and various countries around the world are now starting to mandate you have to have these vaccines. You have to show proof, papers, verifying that you have it against the will of people. They don't have to give their consent. And it raises a really important question. Is that not a violation of the Nuremberg Code, of the number one precept telling someone you have to engage in this
Right.
ongoing experiment of vaccines, whether you want to or not?
There's so many things that we can unpack from that, and I'd like to do a little bit of that. In terms of these mandates, what's happening in Europe and what they're talking about in Europe right now goes far beyond anything we're seeing in the United States. And I'm thankful that it's not happening here, but I'm not confident it won't get there. What they're talking about in Austria, in Germany, and some of these countries in Europe is forced
Mm-hmm.
vaccination. The mandates that we're talking about here, we had just this week, we had Bill de Blasio on his way out of office put in a mandate that if you want to eat in a restaurant, if you want to basically go
Right.
into any public place, you have to show proof of vaccination. And that in and of itself is a violation of private property. And there's all kinds of constitutional problems with that. But what they're talking about in Europe is actually going door to door, asking to asking for proof of
Right.
vaccination. And if you don't have it, they're going to say, roll your sleeve up. You're getting it right
Right.
now. Here's the doctor. That's what was happening during the Holocaust. That is where that line to me and to our founders just gets crossed beyond anything. I mean, to not know and the fact that we're talking about Pfizer and some of these companies don't have to show their
Yeah.
research for 55 years. We don't know anything about these vaccines. And it's really on us to make a choice. We did a whole conversation last week about choices and consequences. And that's the foundation of life is to be able to make the freedom to make choices and address the consequences of those.
It's the essence of being a human being, right? Is to use your reason. We're rational creatures, to use our reason and actually make informed, purposeful, thoughtful choices. And the government saying, no, we're going to make that for you.
Right.
I wanted to add another constitutional, being the constitutionalist in the Vino Veritas Society. I always feel it's my obligation to point these things out. There is an interesting constitutional dynamic here in the United States. So if you look at the design of our Constitution, the federal government has very specific enumerated constitutional powers. There is no such list of enumerated powers for state governments. There are a few prohibitions, restrictions, things that states may not do. Example, a state can't enter into a treaty with a foreign nation, right? That the federal government's supposed to do things like that. So there are a
Mm-hmm.
few things that states are prohibited from doing, but there's no positive list of powers. What that means is that states potentially have a very wide latitude of powers. The founders used a term from the English constitutional tradition, the traditional police powers of government, they said were reserved to the states. And those police powers include the powers to regulate or legislate the health, safety, welfare, and morals of the people. That's a lot of potential power there. That power to regulate the health of the people includes things like vaccines, mandatory, medications, and there
Mm-hmm.
have been states that have required that in the past. They've even been upheld by the Supreme Court. And I would argue for the most part, those decisions are constitutionally correct. We can debate whether it's a good policy or not, but the Constitution does reserve those kinds of powers to state governments, which raises a question: does our own Constitution and those police powers of the state, do those conflict with the Nuremberg Code by allowing things like mandating vaccines? And then there's this other really interesting dimension. You and I were talking about this subject offline before we started recording. When the Nuremberg codes were written, really immediately after the World War II, 1940, I think 1948 maybe was the first time the Nuremberg Code was published. Free, self-governing constitutional republics were still a tiny minority in the United States. Many regimes, including throughout Europe, were regimes that were governments that operated without the consent of the governed. They were tyrannies in various forms. I mean, think of the great power that dominated Europe in those years leading up to World War II, Nazi Germany.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's interesting to have this code that says, hey, you in government, you may not force someone to engage in a medical research, medical experiment, or including taking vaccines, and that you may not do that without their consent. That's what the Nuremberg Code says. And yet you have entire governments that reject the idea of consent altogether.
Right.
They say, no, we're in government. We're the most powerful, or just go back a little bit earlier in time. Well, I'm the king, or I'm the pharaoh, or I'm Caesar, and God has ordained me to lord over you without your consent. Those kinds of rulers, those kinds of tyrannies would laugh at the idea that you need the consent of people to conduct medical research on them, right? I mean, think of a tyrant like Adolf Hitler. From his point of view, he thinks he has the rightful authority to send people to death camps to murder them. So he would laugh at that. He'd say, "Hey, look, if I have the power to murder people, of course I have the power to make them take medicines or vaccines or anything else, or conduct research, on them if I want to."
I do have to point out the irony of the fact that the people who are advocating for these mandates and mandatory vaccines and all of these things are the same ones who call everyone else Nazis, right?
Right.
It's just shocking. But if you go back and if you read Hofstadter and Dewey and Miriam and these early progressives, they would all be in favor of saying, no, you don't get to choose what goes into your body. We do, because we know what's better for you. We are the experts,
that's right.
We're trained. We're the experts. We're the doctors. We're Dr. Fauci, and Dr. Fauci knows better than you ever will about what should go into your body. And somehow, I say this sarcastically, but somehow he can magically know what's best for every single person in the country.
That's right. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. I just want to put it out there as a reminder for our members and our listeners, because that term, you're right, that term gets thrown around, Nazi. It's now almost as ubiquitous as the term racist, right? It really just means someone that a liberal disagrees with or doesn't like. And yet Nazis were, it was a real thing. It was a real movement. It was a real political party. It was the basis of a real and terrible and awful, unjust government. And that political science, the political theory of Nazism, or that led to Nazism, was the exact same political theory that led to progressivism here in the United States. It's the same body of thought. If you asked leading Nazis in the early 1930s, as they were building their regime, what is the central idea? What is the thing that legitimizes the rule of the Nazi party and the Nazi government? Their answer would have been science, scientific expertise. We are building a regime based on science. When Americans say, follow the science,
right?
Nazis would have said, absolutely. That's what we do. We are building bureaus and staffing them with the best scientists to manage and engineer all of society.
And think about all of the horrors that have been done. Nazi Germany is the obvious one, but think about all the people, the great thinkers that we go back to over the years. The way Galileo was treated for saying, I don't think the world is flat, and I don't think the sun revolves around the earth. I think the earth revolves around the sun. He was deemed crazy, and they treated him horribly for challenging the science. And now look how far that's gotten us today.
That's right. Well, I was going to say, so and this whole problem of abandoning constitutional constraints on government power in the name of science or pseudoscience. Alleged scientific experts are going to manage things. This is now the justification in the United States and in regimes around the world to justify really removing all principled limits on government power. And we've talked earlier here today about how it leads to violation of property rights and individual liberty. Then there's this other side. It's the other side of the same coin. It also invites all kinds of corruption. I mean,
Right.
wherever you have government, you tend to have corruption. But as government grows, as it confiscates more money from more people and spends more money, it incentivizes corruption on a mass scale. And we're seeing more and more evidence of this, including some of these huge, spending bills that are working their way through Congress right now.
Well, and we've seen that, especially the last couple weeks. I don't know how many of our members pay close attention to the stock market. I know that that's sort of one of those things that people are either really into it or they just kind of observe it casually or not at all.
Yeah.
And I think some of our members know, I've spent time on and off throughout my career doing some day trading. We have some other friends who are in our movement who've done the same thing. And I've always kind of been fascinated by the markets, really
Mm-hmm.
since graduate school. What we've seen over the last few days, over the last few weeks, has been these major swings, 1,000 points
Right.
down in one day, 600 points up the next day. And it's because these bureaucrats, whether it's Fauci or somebody in the Federal Reserve or all of these other
Mm-hmm.
unconstitutional federal agencies, or it's somebody in Congress, make some statement that they say this is the proven science, these are the proven facts,
Right.
and all of a sudden the market reacts, right? Because if we rely on them to tell us they're making a statement and that's got to be true. So the perfect example is this Omicron variant, which I so badly want to call the G variant. Uh, the, the fact that the World Health Organization admitted that they just skipped over
Yeah.
G in
Yeah.
the Greek alphabet because they didn't
Yeah.
want to upset China's the president of the Chinese Communist Party. It just shows how messed up these bureaucracies are. But
Yep.
this Omicron variant, we first hear from them that okay, it's coming out of South Africa. We're starting to see cases pop up. It's more aggressive and it's more contagious than any variant we've had before.
Run for your lives. It's gonna get you, right?
And everybody starts talking about new lockdowns, new mandates, all of these things because that's the settled science. It is
Yeah.
and in this case they are right. It is the settled science that this variant is supposedly or seems to be more contagious than others. At the Omicron variant, it's more
Right.
like a common cold. The symptoms are much less devastating than
Yeah.
some of the previous ones. And so all of a sudden, so last week the markets went down 1,000 points in a day. We had a near 2,000 point dip at one point, and then all of a sudden they come out 2 days later, 3 days later. We're finding out that maybe our science wasn't
Mm-hmm.
all there. This isn't so bad. And then the markets go earlier this week go up 600 points in a day. It's amazing how they can swing.
I think a lot of people think of markets, things like the stock market and individual stocks, individual markets of industries. They think of these in terms of in business categories, and certainly there's much to be learned studying these things in business terms. It's also true every market really is a study in social psychology. I mean,
Yes.
markets reflect opinions, reflect attitudes. If people are worried, anxious, scared about something, that's going to affect markets. If they're really confident, if they're hopeful, right? If they have reason to
Mm-hmm.
think certain businesses or industries are going to do well, and there's going to be a lot of flourishing and economic growth, those attitudes greatly affect markets. Now, government officials certainly have always had some influence over public opinion, social psychology, right? People's attitudes, moods. But we've talked about this before in some great detail. We're in a whole new environment today. The degree to which government influences opinions, because
Yes.
government influences everything. everything has become politicized because the modern progressive administrative state regulates and subsidizes and controls virtually everything, virtually every area of our life. So now, when officials in government, whether it's elected politicians or unelected bureaucrats, think of nobody vested Anthony Fauci with the power to transform the economic landscape of America. That's not part of his job title. And yet these bureaucrats have so much influence over so many things that the markets can swing wildly up and down based on some
Yeah.
little utterances of unelected bureaucrats who just a few months or years ago no one had even heard their names, and now they're having these enormous impacts on the stock market and really the world economy.
Well, and the other part of it is these politicians have the ability to benefit from it,
Yeah.
right? If they know what's going to come out of this, if they know what the announcement's going to be the next day, I don't want to go making any wild accusations on something that's recorded and anything else. So I'm just going to talk about this hypothetically. the Hypothetically, Nancy Pelosi factually just bought a $25 million home
Yeah.
in South Florida.
No.
How does Nancy Pelosi, who's
Is
never had a job
is it-
outside of government,
Isn't that because her businesses she owns are so productive and successful and profitable?
you could argue that in San Francisco, as a government, as a top government official,
Yeah.
she essentially does own all of those businesses. I mean, she controls everybody's private property anyway.
Right.
Her husband has made a lot of money in stock market,
bet.
in trading, in finance over the years, and they were able to just buy a $25 million home. Now, do we suppose that it's one thing to have insider knowledge?
Mhm.
It's one thing to say, I know this about this company,
Mhm.
that the FDA is going to approve this medication tomorrow,
Right.
so I'm going to go buy a whole bunch of stock in this company tomorrow. That's insider trading,
Yep.
and we have no idea if people in government are doing that or not.
Well,
Hypothetically,
but I mean,
it would be easy for them to do.
I want to add here. Here's a not so hypothetical. Very likely, there was a conversation that included Nancy Pelosi, Joe Biden, and a number of others, and they sat down. They talked, and Joe Biden discussed how he wants to transform the entire federal fleet of cars and trucks to electric. And lo and behold, just before that was made public, Nancy Pelosi's husband buys, I don't remember what it was, $500,000 or $1 million of stock in Tesla, right? Which makes electric cars
Right.
and electric trucks, right? So we see those kinds of things happening all the time that sure smacks of, it sure looks like insider trading. But then there's this other dimension, which is the political class now has so much influence. They don't even need inside knowledge. They can just go make a pronouncement in public and either say something's really good or something's really bad. And they know exactly how many businesses and industries are going to respond. And so they can be calculating, right, their investment strategies based on what they themselves are going to go say in public.
They might not know exactly how big, but they know this information is going to swing the entire market, right? You don't even have to just go buy a specific stock. You go invest in the NASDAQ or the Dow 30 or one of these batch investments, and you can short it, you can buy it, and you can know what's going to happen in the long run or in the short term based on the news that's coming out. We actually just saw it. Pelosi's husband did sell his stock in Tesla, or most of his stock in Tesla, just a few weeks ago. And then when the first round of the Build Back Better plan got passed, it approved new government benefits for electric car makers, so long as those electric car makers were union shops. Tesla is not a union shop. And all of a sudden, Tesla loses all of its government benefits. The stock dropped over 250 points in about 2 weeks.
Well, and I want to be clear here. This kind of crony corruption that we're talking about, this really is endemic to or intrinsic to government. Where you find government, you're going to find corruption. I've been studying the history of governments for a long time. I've yet to see a government that has no corruption attached to it, for the simple fact that government alone has the monopoly on legalized force, and that is so tempting for human beings to abuse. But there's a long history of corruption, including a long history in the United States. A little known episode that really not only preceded the Civil War, it in many ways helped to bring the Civil War on. It was one of the major causes of the Civil War. It
Hmm.
featured Stephen Douglas, the famous Democrat senator from Illinois who debated Lincoln in 1858, the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates. Douglas was desperate to get a territorial government organized out in the Kansas and Nebraska territory. And he needed some Southern votes in the Senate to get this passed. And Southerners were saying to Douglas was from Illinois, we can't even take our slaves there. The old Missouri Compromise of 1820 had prohibited slavery.
Yep.
And so Stephen Douglas makes a deal with the Southerners. He says, okay, I'll tell you what, I'll pass a bill. I'll write a bill called the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and we'll open up those territories to slavery. If the people want slavery, they can have slavery there. And this ignites this huge fight in Congress and then amongst the American people over whether slavery should be allowed to spread or not spread, which contain the question, is slavery good or is it bad? Is it right? Is it wrong? All this erupts in a civil war. And you're thinking to yourself, well, why did Douglas do that? Why did Douglas make this deal with these Southern members of the Senate to allow slavery out into the Kansas territory? And you know what the answer is? Douglas wanted a railroad to be built through Kansas because Douglas was talking to the engineers who were designing where the railroad would actually go, and Stephen Douglas was buying land right where the railroad would go because he knew he would be built, right? Towns would pop up, and that property would become much more expensive, and he could make a bunch of money. So he was willing to open up this whole can of worms, introducing slavery into the Kansas territory, which sets us a firestorm of controversy that eventually leads to the Civil War, really all out of crony corruption. He wanted to make money by that insider knowledge of where the railroads were going to be built. And so the great lesson here is we're never going to get rid of corruption. Wherever you have government, you're going to have misallocations. You're going to have people taking money from others in the form of taxes, and it's so tempting to spend that, by with a contract with your brother-in-law, right, or your friend or whomever it is. And so this is yet another important reason to confine, to restrict, to limit the power of government. It helps to limit the extent of the corruption. Our problem today is we have this sprawling, unconstitutional regulatory state. It's now become an industry. If you really want to get ahead in the world quickly, what you really should do is go spend 5 or 10 years working in a regulatory agency. Go work for the FDA or the EPA, and then you know who will come courting you?
Yeah.
Big, gigantic corporations will offer you millions of dollars in salary to come work for them because you now have mastered the regulatory process. You know how to get things fast tracked inside the FDA or the EPA or any other number of agencies. And this
Right.
happens all the time. People who work in these agencies get these high paying jobs with these businesses because government is regulating, subsidizing, controlling so much that it's not supposed to do.
I'm really glad you made that contrast and comparison between then and now, and showing how some of the similarities and some of the differences before we wrap up today. And we are getting close to that time. But you said something when you were talking about Douglas and you
Mm-hmm.
were talking about that Kansas-Nebraska Act and the Missouri Compromise and that time in history that made me think about everything you said afterward. And that is, you
Yeah.
talked about Congress fighting, and you talked about people and citizens arguing and fighting.
Right.
Imagine there was no progressive bureaucracy
Right.
in the 1840s, 1850s, 1860s. There were no experts who got to
Yep.
make rules and regulations and make these decisions for us because they knew what was best. Think about what the
Sure.
settled science was in many parts of the country and many parts of the world still in those
Yeah.
times. it was founded in racism, right? The settled science was founded in racism.
I'll make the point really as sharp as I can. The settled science in the colleges and universities at that time in the 1840s and the 1850s was scientific evolutionary racism.
Right.
That certain that humanity, first of all, there was no question in the 1840s that race was a genuine scientific category, that the human species is divided into very distinct races, and some are superior and some are inferior, and it corresponded with skin color. And
Right.
those who have darker skin tend to be inferior. And so if we had unelected bureaucrats taking the science from the schools, from the colleges, and applying that to regulations and public policy, it would have been literally institutionalized racism. Not the way that progressives talk about that today, but actual regulations implementing scientific hierarchical racism.
So what you would have had was these people in the South. He wouldn't have even had to go to them, and or they would have all supported him, because the science of the day would have been, well, you can build that railroad, and we're going to support it. Because we would have still had slavery, and it would have been accepted. It's important to also point out that you say that was the settled science in the universities. It's not like that went away after the Civil War. It's not like that went away after the passages of the 13th Amendment. You've shown me documents, and I believe it was Miriam's book. It could have been Hofstadter's book. You can correct me. But you've shown me passages from some of the books that were written right around the turn of the 20th century, the early 19th century, very clearly speak to the idea that they saw races as different, as some are more capable than others, and they very clearly spoke to the idea that some are entitled to freedom and liberty, and some have not earned it yet. Some have not earned the right to live as free people.
They went so far as to say that the white Caucasian race, its historical destiny of white Caucasians is to civilize and improve the inferior races. And so in that sense, they actually justified things like slavery, because they said it's really good because it's bringing the inferior races into close contact with the superior races. So it's like a forced kind of, tutelage or schooling for these inferior races. There's also this fascinating aspect, and this is probably worth a whole discussion on its own. People like Stephen Douglas, the very influential senator from South Carolina, John C. Calhoun, they lambasted Lincoln. They mocked Lincoln, ridiculed him mercilessly, because they said the science has clearly demonstrated that human beings are not equal with regard to natural rights or any natural claim to liberty. They are not equal, that nature is hierarchical, that inequality among the races is the scientific truth. And here's stupid, uneducated, unsophisticated Abraham Lincoln and his fellow Republicans talking about the Declaration of Independence and, self-evident truths about equality. Now, fast forward a generation after the Civil War, those early progressive social scientists who were creating the new graduate departments in political science and sociology and history, they praised not Lincoln.
Right.
They praised people like Stephen Douglas and Calhoun by name. They identified them. And they said, it was a little unfortunate that those guys were promoting slavery, because the Civil War settled that question, that we're not going to have slavery. But they certainly were correct that there's a difference in the races, and some are superior and others are inferior. They identified them by name and heaped tons of praise on them.
And it didn't stop with those early progressives.
Right.
We heard the same thing from guys like Woodrow Wilson and Franklin Roosevelt. You have Joe Biden. This just came back up. We started talking with the news today. It came back up again this week or last week, that Joe Biden is still trying to be the heir to FDR.
Right.
He wants his administration in history to be remarked similarly to Franklin Roosevelt. And so for anybody who says, oh, that those progressives have nothing to do with today's
Right.
progressives, you're really making a stretch to try to claim
That's
that.
right. You're absolutely right. So what that means is the work today of guarding, of protecting, preserving the American idea, it's as important as it was during the New Deal. It's as important as it was when progressive icons like Woodrow Wilson were slandering the Declaration of Independence and making fun of it. The work of guarding the ideas of the American founding, it's as important today as it was in the days of Abraham Lincoln. And really, that's what the Vino Veritas Society is all about: is carrying on that legacy of Lincoln that he himself inherited from the founders, and to keep this body of ideas and the way of life that's built on it, that flows from those ideas, alive and healthy.
We will continue to guard the American idea. Nos somos custodes.
Till next time, Dave.